This, my sweet, is a letter from my solicitor telling you that your husband has filed a petition for divorce. Happy Christmas, Anne.
EastEnders went out for the first time on the 19th of February, 1985, and 18 months later, 30 million people sat down on Christmas Day to watch a man hand his wife a set of divorce papers. No programme in British television history has beaten that audience since. Wendy Richard was in that very first episode, and she was gone at 65. I will come to her, I promise. But the man holding those divorce papers is where this has to start, because when the BBC gave him the keys to the Queen Victoria, he was carrying something that the newspapers had not yet found out. His name was Leslie Grantham. You remember the face before you remember the name? The dark eyes, the sheepskin, the way he could make a whole pub go quiet without raising his voice. Den Watts was not written to be the star of EastEnders. He was written as the landlord, one of 24 people in a square, and within a year he had taken the entire programme over simply by standing still and letting everyone else move around him. That is a rare thing in an actor. Most people act at you. Leslie Grantham made you come to him. He was born in Camberwell in South London on the 30th of April 1947, and the story that everyone knows begins 19 years later, on the 3rd of December 1966, in the German town of Osnabrück. He was a young soldier in the Royal Fusiliers. He had been drinking. He decided to rob a taxi driver at gunpoint, a man named Felix Rees, and in the struggle that followed, the gun went off and Felix Rees was shot in the head and died. I want to be careful here because there is a real family at the end of that sentence. Leslie Grantham never disputed what he had done. He was convicted of murder and he served 10 years in prison. And it was inside prison that a chaplain suggested he try the drama group, which is how one of the most watched actors in British television history learned his trade. In a cell block, in his 20s, with nothing else to do. He came out in 1977. He auditioned. He got small parts, and in 1984 he walked into a casting session for a new twice-weekly serial about a square in the East End of London. And Julia Smith and Tony Holland looked at him and saw exactly what everybody else would see a year later. Here is the thing people forget. The BBC knew he told them. It was in his file before the first episode went out, and the corporation stood by him. What nobody could control was the press, and in 1985, when the whole country wanted to know who this man in the sheepskin was, a newspaper found the court record and put it on the front page. He carried that for the rest of his life. Every profile, every interview, every obituary, the second paragraph was always Osnabrück. And still the work was extraordinary. He appeared in 563 episodes between 1985 and 1989. The Christmas Day episode of 1986, when Den handed Angie those papers with a smile on his face, remains the most watched programme in the history of British television. 30 million people. Think of that. There were only about 56 million people in the country. He left in February 1989 in the most famous exit any soap has ever staged. A bunch of daffodils, a gun, a shot, a splash in the canal. And here is the small, strange detail that tells you everything about how much the audience loved him. They did not accept it. For 14 years, people insisted he was coming back, and in September 2003, the programme gave in and brought him back. And the returning line, "Hello, Princess," got its own headlines. He was killed off properly on the 18th of February 2005. What he did in between those two spells is worth more attention than it usually gets because he did not sit still for 14 years. He went straight into the Paradise Club in 1989, playing a gangster's brother opposite Don Henderson, and it was good, hard, grown-up television. He led a police series called 99-1 in the mid-90s as an undercover officer named Mick Rayner. He turned up as Colonel Mustard when somebody had the idea of making Cluedo into a television programme. For 3 years around the turn of the century, he stood on a French fortress co-presenting Fort Boyard with Melinda Messenger, which is about as far from Albert Square as a man can get. And in 2000, he made a crime drama called The Stretch with, of all people, Anita Dobson, the woman he had spent the 80s shouting at across a bar. Then there was a bad chapter. In 2004, a newspaper set him up with an undercover reporter and a webcam and printed what they got. He said, until the end, that he had been set up. What is not in dispute is what it did to him. He attempted to take his own life 3 times in the months that followed. He talked about it later with a flatness that was hard to listen to. He kept working anyway. He was in a gangster film called Charlie. And at Christmas 2005, he directed himself as the villain in a Peter Pan pantomime in St Albans, which is a very British way for a man to keep going. He spent his last years living in Bulgaria, out of the way of all of it, and came home in June 2018 for treatment. Leslie Grantham died on the 15th of June 2018 in Kensington of lung cancer. He was 71. He had married an Australian woman, Jane Laurie, in 1981, and they had 3 sons before they divorced in 2013. One of those sons, Daniel Laurie, is an actor you have almost certainly watched on a Sunday evening in Call the Midwife. And if you have, you will have noticed the eyes. A man who was written off at 19 built a life, a family, and a piece of television that 30 million people watched at once. Whatever else is true, that is also true. Before I go on, I want to plant something for later. Of the 24 characters who walked into Albert Square in that first episode in 1985, exactly 1 is still there, 41 years on. I will tell you who at the end, and I think the number of years he has done will surprise you. The woman who stood behind that bar opposite him had never carried a series in her life before this one, and within 18 months she was in the top 5 of the singles chart. Angie Watts. The laugh, the eyeliner, the hand on the hip, the way she could go from the funniest woman in the room to the loneliest in about 4 seconds. Anita Dobson was 35 when she took the part, and she had spent her working life in theatre, doing the sort of jobs that pay the rent and never get a photograph in the paper. Then Angie happened, and for about 2 years she could not walk down a street in Britain unrecognised. She was born in Stepney on the 29th of April 1949, which means she was an East End girl playing an East End woman, and you can hear it in every line she delivers. The Den and Angie marriage worked because both of them played it as love gone septic rather than love gone cold. They were still fascinated by each other. That is much harder to act than hatred. Here is the part that always makes people sit up. In the summer of 1986, Anita Dobson put words to the EastEnders theme tune, that mournful little melody everybody in the country could hum, and released it as a single called Anyone Can Fall in Love. It went to number 4, and the man who produced it was Brian May of Queen. They met over that record. He was married at the time, and what followed was long and complicated and played out in public in a way that nobody would enjoy. They married on the 18th of November 2000, and they are married still. She is Lady May now, which is a sentence I do not think anybody in the Queen Vic saloon bar in 1985 would have believed. She left the square in 1988, and unusually for someone that famous in a soap, she never got trapped. She has spent the years since doing the thing she actually trained for: serious theatre, musicals in the West End, including Wicked and Fiddler on the Roof. In 2011, she went on Strictly Come Dancing at 62 and lasted until the back end of November, which anybody who has watched that programme will tell you is a proper run. And then, in her 70s, one of the strangest and most delightful third acts anybody in this story has had. She turned up in Doctor Who as a nosy neighbour called Mrs. Flood, and the whole programme spent 2 years teasing who she really was before revealing her as one of its oldest villains. Watching a woman of 75 walk off with a science fiction series in her 4th decade of work is a joy. In February 2025, for the 40th anniversary, she went back to Albert Square for the first time in decades. She was appointed OBE the same year. She is 77 now and still working, and I would put money on her still working at 85. The next one had already been on your television for 13 years before EastEnders existed. In a department store, in a lift, in a jumper, and half the country did not put the two together for years. Wendy Richard, Pauline Fowler, the cardigan, the shopping bag, the mouth set in a line, the woman who made an entire nation feel guilty for not ringing their mother. She was the moral centre of the square, and she was also, for a long time, the thing people made jokes about. A grumbling, disapproving figure in a knitted top. That is a strange fate for one of the most technically brilliant actresses the programme ever had, and I do not think she ever entirely made peace with it. If you watch this channel, you already know her from somewhere else. For 13 years, from 1972 to 1985, she was Miss Shirley Brahms in Are You Being Served? All 69 episodes, every single one. The sharpest tongue on the ladies' counter at Grace Brothers. She went from that straight into Albert Square, Miss Brahms on a Wednesday and Pauline Fowler on a Thursday, more or less. She was everywhere before that too, if you know where to look. She was Private Walker's girlfriend in Dad's Army. She was in Carry On Matron in 1972 and Carry On Girls the year after. She was in Up Pompeii, which tells you exactly what sort of decade the 70s were for a young actress with a good face and a quick mouth. And she has one more surprise that almost nobody remembers. In 1962, when she was 19, she sang on a record called Come Outside with a man named Mike Sarn. That deadpan, unimpressed Cockney voice answering him back is hers. It went to #1 and stayed there a fortnight. So the woman you think of in a housecoat had a chart-topping single before most of the EastEnders cast had left school. She was born Wendy Emerton on the 20th of July, 1943, above a pub called the Corporation Hotel in Middlesbrough. Not the East End at all, and her parents moved south and eventually ran the Shepherd's Tavern in Mayfair. And then, in December 1954, when she was 11 years old, her father took his own life, and it was Wendy who found him. Her mother died of liver cancer in May 1972, the same year Grace Brothers opened its doors. She had lost both her parents before she was 30, and if you ever wondered where that flint in Pauline Fowler came from, there is at least part of your answer. She played Pauline for 2,058 episodes across 21 years, one of only 2 original cast members to last that long. She married 4 times. She was appointed MBE in 2000 and given a Lifetime Achievement Award at the British Soap Awards in 2007. What most people do not realise is how long she had been fighting. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1996, had surgery and was given the all clear. It came back in 2002 and again she beat it, and by 2005 she was told she was clear. She left the square in 2006, saying plainly that the pressure of the job had become too much for her health, and the programme killed Pauline off on Christmas Day of that year. 21 years, almost to the week after she had first walked into that kitchen. Then in January 2008, the cancer came back a 4th time, and this time it had spread to her kidney, her bones, and her spine. She did something remarkable with the months she had left. She let a documentary crew film her. She talked about dying plainly in her own accent, without any softening, the same tone she used for 21 years on Thursday nights. And on the 10th of October, 2008, she married John Burns. She died 4 months later, on the 26th of February, 2009, at a clinic in Harley Street. She was 65. 65 is not old. She had a #1 single, a department store, a square, an MBE, and a documentary about her own death, and she was 65. And keep that question I left with you somewhere at the back of your mind. 24 characters walked into that square in 1985. One of them is still walking through the same door tonight. We are nowhere near him yet. The woman who came next did not arrive until 9 years in, and by then she had already been married to one of the most notorious men in the East End. And she had done it for real, not on a set. Peggy Mitchell, 4'10" of pure landlady. Get out of my pub! The finger, the hair, the fury, and then, in the same scene, an immediate collapse into tenderness for her boys. Barbara Windsor joined EastEnders in 1994, when she was 56, and everybody assumed her best work was 30 years behind her, and she proceeded to give the programme one of its 3 or 4 defining performances. She was born in Shoreditch on the 6th of August, 1937, and by the time she got to Albert Square, she had already been a national figure twice over. 9 carry-on films between 1964 and 1974. She is the reason a generation of people cannot hear the word matron without smirking. What is easy to miss is that the giggle was a performance. She had come up through Joan Littlewood's theatre company in Stratford East, which was the most serious and least sentimental training available in this country at the time, and she was a very hard worker who chose deliberately to be underestimated. Her private life was not a joke at all. On the 2nd of March 1964, she married Ronnie Knight, who was a genuine face in the East End underworld, and she stayed married to him for almost 21 years until January 1985. She lived a version of the square before she ever set foot in it. Now, in April 2000, she married Scott Mitchell, a former actor almost 30 years younger than her, and that marriage turned out to be the great steady thing of her life. She won Best Actress at the British Soap Awards in 1999. Peggy left the square in a fire in September 2010, came back when the programme needed her, and made her final appearance on the 17th of May 2016. She was made a dame in the New Year honours of 2016. And now the part that a lot of people in this country found genuinely hard. The diagnosis came in April 2014, Alzheimer's, and she told almost nobody. She kept working. She kept turning up. Her husband made it public on the 10th of May 2018 because they had decided that hiding it was helping nobody. And then the two of them did something with it. By August 2019, they were ambassadors for the Alzheimer Society, and Barbara Windsor, by then frail, walked a petition on dementia care up to the door of Downing Street herself. She died on the 10th of December 2020 at a care home in Stanmore, aged 83. Here is what I keep coming back to. A woman whose entire public image was built on being small, giggly and harmless spent the last 2 years she had left campaigning for people who could no longer speak for themselves. That is not a punchline. That is a life. While we are here, I would like to know which of these people your house watched for. Not who you were most shocked by. Which face made you turn the television on. Put it below if you would, because I read every one of them. And on this programme, the answers are never the ones I expect. The next one served in the Royal Navy before she ever stood on a stage, and she once held an entire half-hour episode entirely on her own, with nobody else on screen at all. Dot Cotton. The hairnet, the cigarette, the Bible on the launderette counter, and that voice, a marvellous, worrying, endlessly kind, endlessly judgmental voice that could turn a line about a boil wash into scripture. June Brown played her for 2,884 episodes, which is more than any other woman in the programme's history. She was born in Needham Market in Suffolk on the 16th of February 1927, one of 5 children, and one of her brothers and sisters died in infancy. She served in the Women's Royal Naval Service in the last years of the Second World War. She was a Wren. She used to say, with some amusement, that the discipline of it never left her. She had a long career behind her before Dot, and it was not a light one. She played Hedda Gabler. She played Lady Macbeth. She did an Inspector Calls and A View from the Bridge and the Lion in Winter, and she directed in the theatre as well, which very few actresses of her generation were allowed to do. And in 1970, she spent 3 episodes in Coronation Street as a woman called Mrs. Parsons. So before she was the most famous face on one soap, she had already been on the other one. The surprise here, though, is not a role. It is a piece of television. In 2008, when she was 81, EastEnders gave her an entire episode alone. 30 minutes of one woman talking into a tape recorder. No other actor on screen, no cutaways. Nobody in British soap had ever done it before, and nobody has done it since. She was nominated for a BAFTA for Best Actress the following year, at 82. She had already won Best Actress at the Inside Soap Awards in 2005, and a Lifetime Achievement Award in the same year. Her own life had more grief in it than Dot's ever did. She married the actor John Garley in 1950, and he took his own life in 1957. She married another actor, Robert Arnold, in 1958, and they had 6 children together, and she nursed him through Lewy body dementia until his death in 2003. She was appointed MBE in 2008 and promoted to OBE in 2022. In 2013, she wrote her memoirs and called the book Before the Year Dot, which is exactly the sort of joke she would make. From 2015, her eyesight began to fail with macular degeneration, and by the end, she could not properly see the faces of the people she was talking to, which for a woman who loved company was the cruelest possible loss. She played Dot from 1985 to 1993, and again from 1997 until 2020, and on the 20th of February 2020, at 93 years of age, she announced that she had left for good. She did it in 5 words: no fuss, no farewell tour. June Brown died on the 3rd of April 2022, at home in Chipstead in Surrey. She was 95. She smoked for most of her life, she was funny about it, and she outlived nearly everybody who warned her. The man who came next spent the early part of his career being thrown off things and set on fire for money. And he was once sacked for a joke about a very famous actor's face. Frank Butcher. The car lot, the terrible jackets, the running of a hand over a bald head, the laugh that started as a wheeze. Mike Reid arrived in 1987 and immediately made the square funnier. And then, because that is what this programme does, made it sadder. His scenes with Pat and later his scenes with Peggy are as good as any comedy actor has ever been given in a soap. He was born in Hackney on the 19th of January, 1940, and before anyone had heard of him, he was a stuntman. Real ones. He took falls on Casino Royale and on The Dirty Dozen, both in 1967. He was hired as an underwater double for Roger Moore on The Saint, and then lost the job, according to the story he told for the rest of his life, for making a remark about Moore's looks within earshot of the wrong person. He was a stand-up in clubs and on cruise ships. And in 1971, the series The Comedians made him famous overnight. That rapid-fire Cockney delivery, the wallop, that people still shouted at him in the street 30 years later. In 1975, he did what every comic of that era eventually did, and made a novelty record, a version of The Ugly Duckling, and the thing went to number 10. Then something happened that nobody expected. From 1975 to 1981, he hosted a children's game show called Runaround, and an entire generation of British children grew up thinking of this hard-faced East End comic as the man who bellowed, "Run around now," at them on a Tuesday afternoon. He played Frank Butcher in 780 episodes between 1987 and 2000, with returns in 2002 and 2005. There was a loss in the middle of it that he never really recovered from, and it came twice. In March 1990, his son Mark took his own life. 4 months later, Mark's baby daughter died of sudden infant death syndrome. Reid spoke about it very rarely and, when he did, in the fewest words possible. He had married Shirley Alder in 1971 and they had 2 sons. By the mid-2000s, he was semi-retired and living in a villa in Spain, and it was there in Marbella on the 29th of July 2007 that he died of a suspected heart attack. He was 67. More than 250 people came to the church at Little Easton in Essex to bury him a fortnight later, which for a man who started out falling off things for a day rate is a decent measure of a life. We are 2 people away now from the answer to the question I set you at the start. The one original character who is still on that square tonight, 41 years on. Hold on a little longer. He is worth the wait. And the number attached to him is genuinely hard to believe. The next name is one that most people would never guess because he was the very first actor cast in this programme. Before the square had a name, before a single wall was built. Arthur Fowler. The allotment, the shed, the cardigan, the quiet man being slowly ground down by things he could not say out loud. Bill Treacher was the first person hired for EastEnders. The character was written for him before the casting even started, and what he did with it changed what British soap thought it was allowed to do. It is worth remembering how uncertain the whole thing was at that point. Julia Smith and Tony Holland were building a twice-weekly serial for a corporation that had never made a successful one, on a lot in Elstree. With a cast largely made up of people nobody could put a name to, about 17 million people watched that first episode in February 1985, which sounds enormous now and was, at the time, considered a wobbly start. Nobody involved was confident. They hired Bill Treacher first because they needed one certainty to build the rest around. He was born in Dagenham on the 4th of June, 1930, one of 8 children, and he grew up in Hackney and Bethnal Green. He did his national service in the Royal Air Force and then spent 4 years as a steward on P&O ships, saving up, because he had decided he was going to be an actor, and the training cost money he did not have. He paid for it himself with wages earned at sea, and he made his West End debut in 1963. Then, in 1986, EastEnders gave Arthur Fowler a nervous breakdown. He lost his job. He took money from the Christmas Club. He was arrested. And over months, not episodes, months, the audience watched a decent man come apart. Nobody had done that at 7:30 in the evening before. Bill Treacher played it without a shred of self-pity, and there are people who still talk about it as the moment the programme proved what it could be. He stayed until 1996. He married the Australian actress Catherine Kessie in 1971, and they had 2 children, Jamie and Sophie, and they made their home in Suffolk. In 2015, he told an interviewer that he had ataxia, a degenerative condition that takes your balance and then your mobility, and that he had retired for good and used a wheelchair much of the time. He talked about it without complaint, in the same steady voice he gave Arthur. Bill Treacher died in Ipswich on the 5th of November 2022 of pneumonia. He was 92. The first actor ever cast in EastEnders lived to see it turn 37 years old. The girl who played his daughter was 17 when she moved into that house, and today she has a job that puts her in charge of everybody on the set, including the cameras. Michelle Fowler. If you were watching in 1985 and 1986, you did not just watch Michelle, you worried about her. The teenage pregnancy, the refusal to name the father, and then that scene on the bench by the canal when the audience found out it was Den. Susan Tully was in her teens, and she held her own opposite Leslie Grantham, which is not a small thing to do. She was born in London on the 20th of October 1967, and she was already familiar to younger viewers as Suzanne Ross in Grange Hill before EastEnders started. She played Michelle from the first episode on the 19th of February 1985 until the 26th of October 1995, a full decade. And then she did the thing almost nobody in her position does. She walked away from acting entirely, and she has turned down every offer to come back since. When the programme wanted Michelle again in 2016, they had to recast the part. Here is where she went. She became a director, not a soap director padding out a schedule, a proper sought-after drama director credited as Sue Tully. She directed EastEnders itself at the end of the 90s. She spent 5 years on The Bill. She directed Silent Witness for 3 years, and then, in 2019, episodes of Line of Duty at the very height of it, when 11 million people were watching. She directed the strike films through to 2024. She is 58, she is still working, and the fact that a teenage soap actress with no formal training built a directing career at that level is, to me, the single most impressive thing in this entire story. There is one person left. He is the answer to the question I asked you at the start, and he has now spent more of his life inside Albert Square than outside it. Adam Woodyatt, Ian Beale, the market stall, the chip shop, the disasters, the schemes, the hair going and then coming back and then going again. He has played Ian since the very first episode on the 19th of February 1985 when he was 16 years old, and he is the longest-serving regular cast member in the programme's history. If you have any idea how rare that is in television, you will know that it is close to impossible. He was born Adam Brinley Woodyatt in Walthamstow on the 28th of June, 1968. In 2013, he was given the British Soap Award for Outstanding Achievement, which sounds like the sort of thing you get on the way out, except that it was not. He had another decade in him, and he took it. He took an extended break at the end of 2020 and said, at the time, that he had no plans to go back. He went into the jungle on I'm a Celebrity in 2021 and finished 6th. He toured the country in a stage thriller called Looking Good Dead, and then in My Fair Lady. He separated from his wife Beverly in 2019 after 21 years. They had married at Disney World in Florida in 1998, which is a very 1998 thing to do. And their divorce went through in 2022. It was, by any measure, an unsettled few years for a man who had done the same job since he was a schoolboy. Then in December 2022, he came back for one episode. Dot Cotton's funeral, June Brown's send-off, and it felt right that Ian should be there. And in 2023, he came back for good. He is 58. He has been Ian Beale for 41 years. When he first walked onto that set, Leslie Grantham was pulling pints behind the bar, Wendy Richard was in the kitchen at number 45, Bill Treacher was on the allotment, and Adam Woodyatt was a teenager with a Saturday job's worth of experience. All three of those people are gone now, and he is still standing on the same square in the same fictional postcode, doing the same job, 4 nights a week. And the programme is still there with him. More than 7,300 episodes have been made since that first February night, and there is another one going out on BBC One this week at 7:30, the way there has been for 4 decades. Very little on British television has ever managed that. 41 years ago, 24 characters walked into a square in the East End of London, and a programme that the BBC was not at all sure about became the thing that 30 million of us watched on a Christmas afternoon. Some of the people who made that happen are still working. Anita Dobson taking over a science fiction series in her 70s, Susan Tully directing some of the best drama on television, Adam Woodyatt still behind that counter. Some of them are not. Wendy Richard was 65, Leslie Grantham was 71, Mike Reid was 67. If this is the sort of thing you like, the real stories behind the programmes you grew up with, told properly and without the nonsense, then do subscribe, because there is a whole shelf of British television waiting and I'm working through it one show at a time. What strikes me, looking at all 9 of them together, is how little of it was accidental. A man taught himself to act in a prison cell. Another paid for his training with wages earned on a ship. A girl of 11 found her father dead and grew into the woman the whole country trusted to tell them off. A comic who fell off things for a living ended up doing the best work of his career at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening. They were not stars who were handed a square. They were working people who built one. And for 41 years now, 4 nights a week, we have been let in through that door to have a look.